All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're putting on two hats at once. We're stepping into the roles of both a scientific philosopher and a cultural historian. We're going to unpack a truly fascinating document titled Dielectric Entropy and the Iranian National Spirit. And, what makes this source text so incredibly unique is how it analyzes modern Middle Eastern geopolitics through a completely unconventional lens. It literally takes the fundamental laws of thermodynamics, the hard physics of energy and heat, and seamlessly merges them with the ancient epic cosmology of Persia. It's this bold, highly intellectual framework that frames a national struggle not just as your standard political issue, but as a literal physics problem. Okay, let's dive into this. The core thesis of the entire document states that culture and life only flourish through the dielectric tension of opposites. The source text roots this argument deeply in ancient Persian cosmology, specifically the lore found in Ferdowsi's epic poem, the Shahnameh. It points directly to the eternal mythological tension between Ohrmazd, the spirit of creation and light, and Ahriman, the spirit of decay and darkness. And according to the author's analysis, it's precisely this push and pull, this massive cosmic friction between two opposing forces that actually generates the spark of life and culture in any society. So here's our roadmap for the explainer today. First, we'll look at the cosmic battery. Second, the thermodynamics of a nation. Third, the dynamic versus the static. And finally, number 4, entropy and the turning wheel. Let's jump in.
Part 1, the cosmic battery, taking us from ancient myths right into modern physics.
Now, what's really interesting here is how, before applying this analysis to real-world political actors, the author sets up a theoretical framework by introducing a really precise definition. They call it the mechanical dialectic. So, a dialectic is essentially a dialogue or a tension between two conflicting ideas or forces, right? But think of this specifically as viewing a political revolution through the lens of a Duracell battery. A standard battery absolutely requires a positive and a negative terminal. It's the dialectic tension, the actual physical struggle between those opposing poles, that allows an electrical current to flow. The author uses this exact mechanical metaphor to explain the forces driving a nation's spirit. Because without that tension, the energy stops, the culture just dies. And to explain the positive charge inside this cosmic battery, the text invokes the concept of Amesha Spenta. In ancient tradition, this represents the dynamic, life-affirming energy of the cosmos. According to the document, having this dynamic energy is the absolute non-negotiable requirement to keep a society from stagnating. It's literally the spark of creation. It's the force that actively pushes back against decay and propels a culture forward into the future. Without this spark, any society, no matter where it is, just begins to rot. Moving along to part 2, thermodynamics of a nation. Conservation versus entropy. And this brilliantly illustrates where the analysis gets truly fascinating, because the source text suddenly transitions from the realm of ancient mythology directly into the fundamental, unyielding laws of physics. The author maps this out perfectly. On one side, you have the first law of thermodynamics, the conservation of energy, right? The idea that energy can't be created or destroyed, only transformed. The author equates this to Ohrmazd, the dynamic creation force, and then maps it directly onto the Artesh, the Iranian Nationalist Army. Then on the flip side, you have the second law of thermodynamics, entropy. This is the scientific principle that closed systems inevitably degrade into total disorder. The text maps this onto Ahriman, the static force of decay, and equates it politically to the IRGC, the Theocratic Guard. So the author is quite literally defining this geopolitical struggle as an epic, natural fight between conservation and entropy. Which brings us to section 3, the dynamic versus the static, a geopolitical equation. So the crucial point is how the text impartially contrasts these two modern Iranian institutions, moving us from the theoretical to the geopolitical reality happening right now. The author frames the Artesh, the Nationalist Army, as this dynamic, open system that naturally aligns with the first law of thermodynamics. It's positioned as an entity that is inherently capable of transforming and adapting to new energy. In stark contrast, the IRGC, the Theocratic Guard, is framed by the author as a completely closed system. It's described as being ruled entirely by static dogma, which rigidly locks it into the second law of thermodynamics, that inescapable law of entropy which is talked about. To really understand why this matters, the source breaks down the literal mechanics of these systems. Open systems, by definition in physics, can exchange energy with their outside environment. Therefore, they can evolve, they can adapt, they can grow. Closed systems, however, completely reject outside energy. And the author asserts that because the current theocratic system operates as this closed loop entirely wrapped in static dogma, it fundamentally refuses to evolve. And in physics, when a system is closed and simply cannot take in new energy, entropy takes over. Decay is mathematically accelerated. The text argues that this setup inevitably prevents the flourishing of life within the nation. It's a dead end.
And that leads us to our final section, Part 4, Entropy and the Turning Wheel.
Let's move on and see how this builds into what the author views as an almost mathematical sequence of events. If we accept the premise that a geopolitical struggle is bound by the exact same laws as a physics problem, here is how the chain reaction plays out. Step 1. A system becomes closed and relies entirely on static dogma. Step 2. Because it's closed, the second law of thermodynamics takes hold, meaning entropy, disorder, and decay instantly begin to multiply. Step 3. The text posits that the system must, inevitably, collapse under its own decaying weight. And finally, Step 4. Once that static system fractures, the dynamic, cyclical energy of the open system is naturally restored. The author presents this not as just some political opinion, but as an unavoidable, objective chain reaction dictated by natural laws. To capture this sense of absolute inevitability, the text loops right back to the Shahnameh with this beautifully epic metaphor, the turning wheel of the heavens. This phrase represents the unstoppable, cyclical nature of time and cosmic energy. According to the document, the turning wheel guarantees the ultimate, cyclical triumph of dynamic energy over static entropy. The author essentially views the return of the dynamic nationalist spirit as something that absolutely cannot be permanently halted. Why? Well, simply because you can't stop the laws of thermodynamics, and you sure can't stop the turning wheel of the heavens. Which leaves us with this really profound question, drawn directly from the very core of the source's mechanical dialectic. If a geopolitical structure functions as a totally closed loop governed by static dogma, can it ever truly survive the entropic laws of nature and the turning wheel of history? Or is its collapse just a mathematical inevitability waiting to happen? It's an incredibly fascinating way to view the world, merging the hard laws of science with the sweeping arcs of ancient mythology to make sense of the struggles we see today. Take some time to ponder that cosmic equation for yourself. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.